Next speaker is Emily Bernate. Emily is a PhD candidate in Hispanic studies who works with sociolinguistics and gender differences in language. Her dissertation advisor is Dr. Manuel Gutierrez. She has taught Spanish for several years in both the second language and heritage programs here at the University of Houston. She is always looking for ways to make her research on language and gender into the classroom. Today, she will give us some insight into a very specific aspect of everyday conversation, verbal politeness. Emily.
Give me your attention. Pay attention. Listen to me. So those are very awkward ways of starting a presentation. And that's because of the verb conjugations that I used. So I imagine many of you are university professors, or at least know a few. So I won't have to go on and on about the joys of complying with your posted office hour schedule, waiting for students to come with all kinds of stories and requests. So imagine waiting at your office when a student comes in, sits down, introduces himself, and says, "Give me an extension on the assignment." Give me? Well, that doesn't sound right, does it? Don't you think that in order to be more effective at getting that extension, he should try to be more polite? You would probably prefer to hear something like, "Can you give me an extension?" Or maybe, "Would you give me an extension?" Although the message is the same, each of these phrases has a different level of politeness. And that's because they each have a different verb conjugation. Now, the phrase "give me" isn't all bad. It was an awkward way to start a presentation, and probably a rude way to ask for an extension. But in a life or death situation, it's probably the best option, and that's because different social situations require different levels of politeness. So when a verb conjugation changes the level of politeness in a sentence, this phenomenon is referred to as verbal politeness. So I study verbal politeness in Spanish, and in Spanish there are more verb forms available for making requests than there are in English. And there are two main ways that these verbs may make a sentence sound more polite. Verbs can add either temporal or material distance. Now, material distance doesn't exactly work the same way in English because we no longer use the subjunctive. But it's sort of like setting your request in an alternate reality where it may not be possible for the other person to help you out. We do, however, use temporal distance all the time. For example, let's say you want to ask your boss for a few days off of work because you need a vacation. You might start by saying, "Hi, I wanted to know if," before you make your request. Well, wanted is past tense, and you didn't want to know in the past, you actually want to know right now. But using a past tense to describe something you want in the present adds some temporal distance, which in our minds becomes synonymous with social distance, respect, and politeness. So we know that temporal and material distance help verbs sound more polite, but until now, verbal politeness has not been widely studied because it's difficult to quantify. So to solve this problem, I developed a verbal politeness scale, which accounts for all of the verb forms in Spanish that can be used to make requests. It starts from level 1, the imperative, like "give me," and with each level increases in the amount of social distance based on the amount of temporal or material distance, or both, that it expresses, thus becoming progressively more and more polite as we go upwards. So this scale has allowed me to quantitatively study how different kinds of Spanish speakers utilize verbs when making requests. So we know that verbal politeness is an important part of making requests in Spanish, but this starts to change in language contact situations. So in a language contact situation, a group of speakers that uses one language, like Spanish, comes into contact with a group of speakers that speaks a different language, like English. And at least one of those groups, usually the group with the least social power, starts to alter their linguistic behavior and becomes more and more bilingual. Now, researchers have found that bilingualism causes a strain on the brain because it has to remember two separate linguistic systems, like double the information. So as a way of lightening this cognitive load, it starts to use fewer and fewer verb forms in the lesser used language. So for the case of Spanish in the United States, the lesser used or least socially powerful language that starts to simplify in the amount of verb forms is Spanish. Now, this isn't always the case for first-generation speakers, but their children will most likely only use Spanish inside the home because they'll eventually use English in almost all other social situations. Now, the fact that they're only consistently using Spanish inside the home is very important for verbal politeness because the way we speak at home is very different from the way we speak in public. For example, let's say I have a heavy stack of books because I'm a grad student and I need some help. Well, to a family member, it's fine to say, hey, here, help me with some of these. And help me, like give me, is an imperative form or level 1 on the verbal politeness scale. Now, to a coworker who's not my best friend, I might say something like, hi, can you help me with some of these? And that's a present tense or level 2 on the verbal politeness scale. And to a very important, elusive boss, if I do get the courage to ask, it might be something like, excuse me, ma'am, would you maybe mind possibly helping me with the few, but just a few, I know you're busy and I'm sorry, I shouldn't ask, and ramble on. And there was a conditional or level 4 form in there. So we can see that as social distance increases, so should verbal politeness. But for speakers of Spanish in the United States, they're not always exposed to these formal situations in Spanish outside the home. So to better understand the relationship between language contact and verbal politeness, I looked at how people in 3 different levels of contact utilize verbs when they're making requests. So I have a control group of monolingualism in Mexico City, a group of stable bilingualism in Brownsville on the border, and a group of transitional bilingualism in Houston. So as we go further north, their exposure to English increases and the use of Spanish starts to decline. When I look at their requests, what I found was that as language contact increases, verbal politeness decreases, meaning they produced lower rated verbs on the verbal politeness scale, which is not surprising. But this phenomenon does not affect everybody the same. I also identified distinct gender patterns. So we can see that while verbal politeness does decline for everybody in contact situations, it drops off more sharply for men than for women. So the relationship between language contact and verbal politeness is clear, but what about gender? Well, it would be an oversimplification to say that women are just nicer, men are just kind of rude, because, well, we can't say that, because that would ignore the larger social context of language that's shaped through power relations. So why are women in contact situations utilizing more verbal politeness than men when their linguistic exposure is similar? Well, sometimes certain social groups have to work harder to get what they want or to make themselves heard without appearing overbearing or demanding or unreasonable. You see, women often walk a fine linguistic line between appearing authoritative and bossy. They often fear they're one linguistic misstep away from their power being perceived as pushiness. So they step back, start adding more politeness through their verbs, and start apologizing for the things they're saying. I know I have. So I'd like to leave you with one final thought. What can you do about this? Well, I imagine you've all been in a situation in which you felt you needed to be more polite than the people around you. So in that situation, think about the power relations that shaped your words, because those are the power relations that shape our world. And if one day you would like for all of the users of your language to be judged by the same linguistic expectations without having to walk this linguistic tightrope, I hope you will help me challenge those power relations in whatever work you choose to do. Thank you.